Welcome to our channel, where we explore some of the most complex and controversial cases in true crime. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the West Memphis 3, a case that has not only captivated the public, but has also become a symbol of the potential flaws in the American justice system. This is the story of 3 teenagers wrongfully convicted of a horrific crime, the relentless fight to prove their innocence, and the profound impact this case has had on our understanding of justice. On May 5, 1993, the small town of West Memphis, Arkansas was rocked by a crime that would haunt it for years. 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, went out to play and never returned home. Their families, gripped by growing panic, reported them missing later that evening. A massive search ensued, and the next day, the bodies of the 3 boys were found in a wooded area called Robin Hood Hills. The discovery was nothing short of a nightmare. The boys had been brutally murdered, their hands and feet bound with their own shoelaces, and one of the boys, Christopher Byers, had been mutilated in a manner that suggested sexual assault. The sheer brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the community. Parents were terrified, the police were under immense pressure to solve the case, and the media quickly picked up the story. As is often the case in such high-profile crimes, the community's demand for swift justice was intense. The police needed to find the perpetrators quickly to reassure a terrified public. But in their rush to find justice, did they overlook critical evidence? Did the desire for a quick resolution cloud their judgment? To understand what went wrong, we need to examine the investigation that followed. From the very beginning, the investigation into the murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers was marred by questionable practices and a lack of solid evidence. The West Memphis Police Department, faced with a crime of unprecedented brutality and a community gripped by fear, quickly zeroed in on 3 local teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. Why these 3? Damian Eccles, then 18 years old, was an obvious target for suspicion in the eyes of the local authorities. He was an outsider in the conservative community. He dressed in black, listened to heavy metal music, and had a known interest in the occult. For many in the town, Damian's unconventional appearance and interests made him a prime suspect. Jason Baldwin, 16 years old and Damian's close friend, was also pulled into the investigation because of his association with Damian. Jesse Miskelly Jr., who was 17 years old and had an IQ of just 72, was a vulnerable target for police coercion. The police were convinced that they had found the perpetrators, even though there was no physical evidence linking the 3 teenagers to the crime scene. Instead of following the evidence, the investigation seemed to focus on confirming the police's preconceived notions about the boys. This tunnel vision would have devastating consequences. One of the most controversial aspects of the West Memphis 3 case is the confession of Jesse Miskelly Jr. On June 3, 1993, Jesse was brought in for questioning by the West Memphis police. The interrogation lasted over 12 hours, during which Jesse was questioned without a lawyer or a parent present. After hours of intense questioning, Jesse confessed to the murders. But the details of his confession were troubling. Jesse's confession was riddled with inconsistencies and factual inaccuracies. He claimed that the murders had occurred in the morning, but the boys were last seen alive in the evening. He said that the boys were tied up with rope, but they were actually bound with shoelaces. He also got the nature of the wounds wrong, suggesting a lack of understanding of what had actually happened. It quickly became clear that Jesse was parroting back information fed to him by the police. Despite the obvious flaws in the confession, the police and prosecutors latched onto it as the key piece of evidence they needed to secure convictions. Jesse later recanted his confession, stating that he had been coerced and was scared during the interrogation. He claimed he only confessed because he wanted to go home, but the damage was done. Jesse's confession would be used to convict him, along with Damian and Jason. To fully understand the West Memphis 3 case, it's crucial to consider the cultural context in which it unfolded. The early 1990s in America was a time when the nation was gripped by the satanic panic, a widespread fear that satanic cults were ritually abusing and murdering children. This moral panic, fueled by sensationalist media coverage, created an environment in which anyone associated with the occult or unconventional behavior could be seen as a potential threat. Damien Echols, with his interest in the occult, became the perfect scapegoat in the eyes of the authorities and much of the public. The prosecution seized upon this fear, painting Damien as the ringleader of a satanic cult that had committed the murders as part of a ritual. They pointed to his interest in black magic, his collection of Stephen King novels, and his preference for wearing black as evidence of his guilt. The satanic panic allowed the prosecution to divert attention away from the lack of physical evidence. Instead of focusing on concrete proof, they built their case on the idea that these three teenagers, because of their appearance and interests, were capable of committing such a heinous crime. The trial became less about what actually happened and more about who these boys were perceived to be. The trials of Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly were deeply flawed from the start. They were tried separately, with Jesse's trial taking place first. Despite the glaring inconsistencies in his confession, the jury convicted Jesse of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment plus 40 years. Next came the joint trial of Damien and Jason. The prosecution leaned heavily on Jesse's coerced confession, even though Jesse refused to testify against his co-defendants. Without his testimony, the prosecution relied on dubious evidence, including testimony from a jailhouse informant who claimed that Damien had confessed to him while they were both in jail. This informant later recanted his testimony, but not before it helped secure Damien's conviction. Damien was sentenced to death, while Jason, who had refused a plea deal in exchange for a lighter sentence, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The convictions were based on fear, prejudice, and a desperate need to find someone to blame for the horrific crime. The actual evidence was thin at best, and much of it was either circumstantial or outright false. The West Memphis Three might have been forgotten, their lives unjustly spent behind bars, if not for the release of the HBO documentary Paradise Lost, the child murders at Robin Hood Hills in 1996. This groundbreaking documentary, directed by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, brought the case to a national audience and raised serious questions about the fairness of the trials and the guilt of the three young men. Paradise Lost laid bare the flaws in the investigation and trial. It exposed the weak evidence, the questionable tactics used by the police, and the way the satanic panic had influenced the prosecution's case. The documentary also humanized the West Memphis Three, showing them not as monstrous killers, but as scared, confused teenagers who had been swept up in a legal nightmare. The impact of Paradise Lost was profound. It sparked a movement to free the West Memphis Three, with people from all walks of life coming together to advocate for their release. Celebrities like Eddie Vedder, Johnny Depp, and Natalie Maines became vocal supporters, using their platforms to raise awareness and funds for the legal battle to exonerate Damien, Jason, and Jesse. As public support for the West Memphis Three grew, so did the efforts to re-examine the evidence that had led to their convictions. Over the years, advancements in forensic science provided new tools for analyzing the evidence from the crime scene. DNA testing, which had not been available at the time of the original trial, was conducted on the physical evidence collected from Robin Hood Hills. The results were startling. None of the DNA found at the crime scene matched Damien, Jason, or Jesse. Instead, some of the DNA was consistent with that of Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch, one of the victims. This new evidence cast further doubt on the guilt of the West Memphis Three and raised new questions about who might have actually committed the crime. In addition to the DNA evidence, there were other significant developments. Several key witnesses who had testified against the West Memphis Three recanted their statements, claiming that they had been pressured by the police to provide false testimony. The jailhouse informant who had testified against Damien admitted that he had lied in exchange for leniency in his own case. It became increasingly clear that the convictions were based on a house of cards that was beginning to crumble. Despite these revelations, the Arkansas legal system was reluctant to admit its mistakes. Appeals for a new trial were repeatedly denied, even as evidence of the boys' innocence continued to mount. The state seemed more interested in preserving the integrity of the original convictions than in seeking the truth. After years of legal battles, a breakthrough finally came in 2011. The West Memphis Three were offered a deal, a chance to enter an Alford plea. This legal maneuver allows defendants to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict them. It's a way for both sides to save face. The defendants can walk free, but the state doesn't have to admit to a wrongful conviction. On August 19, 2011, after spending 18 years in prison, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly walked out of prison as free men. But their freedom came at a cost. The Alford plea meant that their convictions were not overturned, and they remained officially guilty in the eyes of the law. It was a bittersweet moment, freedom at the price of full exoneration. For Damian, Jason, and Jesse, the Alford plea was a necessary compromise. Damian, who had spent nearly 2 decades on death row, was in failing health and desperate to escape the threat of execution. Jason, who had long maintained his innocence and refused to accept a plea deal in the past, reluctantly agreed to the Alford plea out of concern for Damian's life. Jesse, who had been the most vulnerable of the three from the start, was simply relieved to finally be free. Since their release, the West Memphis Three have continued to fight to clear their names completely. Damian Eccles, in particular, has become a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform, using his platform to speak out against the flaws in the system that nearly cost him his life. He has written several books about his experience and continues to push for full exoneration. The case of the West Memphis Three remains unsolved, and the real killers of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers have never been brought to justice. The DNA evidence pointing to Terry Hobbs has raised suspicions, but no new charges have been filed, and the investigation remains officially closed. For the families of the victims, the lack of closure is a painful reminder that justice has not been fully served. The West Memphis Three case is more than just a story of wrongful convictions. It's a powerful commentary on the flaws in the American justice system. It's a case that highlights the dangers of a legal process driven by fear, prejudice, and a rush to judgment. It shows how easily the truth can be overshadowed by hysteria, and how the most vulnerable members of society can be swept up in the machinery of injustice. The case also underscores the importance of public awareness and media scrutiny in holding the justice system accountable. Without the exposure provided by Paradise Lost and the subsequent support of celebrities and the general public, it's likely that the West Memphis Three would still be languishing in prison, their voices unheard. Thanks for tuning in, and make sure to subscribe. Until next time, stay safe.